October 24, 1944. Cold rain was falling through the dark pine forest of eastern France. Hidden somewhere in that fog, more than 150 German soldiers were preparing to attack. But standing in their way was one American sergeant and just 11 exhausted men. No artillery, no reinforcements, almost no ammunition. For 4 days they would fight a battle that should have lasted only minutes. A battle against overwhelming numbers. A battle against tanks. A battle that would turn a quiet hill in France into one of the most unbelievable last stands of World War II. And at the center of it all was a 23-year-old technical sergeant from Tennessee, Charles H. Coolidge. The story begins at 7:30 in the morning on October 24, 1944. Technical Sergeant Charles Coolidge crouched low behind a line of wet pine trees in the Vosges Mountains of France. The forest smelled of mud, wet leaves, and gunpowder. Rainwater dripped slowly from the branches above him. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. Coolidge had been fighting in Europe for more than a year. He had already survived some of the bloodiest battles of the war. Salerno, Anzio, San Pietro, the Rapido River, Monte Cassino. Every one of those battles had taken friends from him. Every one of them had left scars. Now the 36th Infantry Division had pushed north from southern France toward the German border. And the Germans had chosen this forest to make their stand. The Vosges Mountains were a nightmare battlefield. Steep hills, thick forests, narrow paths, perfect terrain for ambushes, perfect terrain for machine guns, perfect terrain for soldiers who knew the land better than their enemy. Coolidge knew something else too. The men behind him were not experienced soldiers. Most of them had arrived in France only weeks earlier. They were replacements. Young men who had crossed the Atlantic and were thrown straight into combat. Some of them had never fired their rifles at a real enemy before. And now, they were about to face battle for the first time. A small force on a lonely hill. Coolidge had been ordered to defend a position known as Hill 623. It wasn't a large hill, but it controlled a key approach through the forest. If the Germans captured it, they could break through the American line. Coolidge had only 12 soldiers with him. 12 men to defend an entire hill. His strongest weapons were 2 water-cooled Browning .30 caliber machine guns. Heavy weapons designed to fire thousands of rounds without overheating. If placed correctly, they could stop an entire infantry assault. But only if the men operating them stayed calm under fire. Coolidge looked down the line of foxholes. The soldiers looked nervous. Some were checking their rifles again and again. Others stared silently into the trees. They were waiting for something terrible to happen. Coolidge had seen this look before. He had seen it in Italy. He knew what these young soldiers were feeling. Fear, uncertainty, the terrible realization that training was over. And war was real. The scouting mission. Coolidge knew he couldn't just sit and wait. He needed to understand the terrain. He needed to know where the Germans were. So he took one soldier from Company K and moved forward into the forest. They moved slowly, carefully, step by step through the wet undergrowth. Fog hung between the trees like smoke. Visibility was barely 30 yards. Every sound seemed louder in the silence. Branches snapping under boots. Water dripping. The distant rumble of artillery somewhere far away. Then suddenly, Coolidge froze. Through the fog he could see shapes. Dozens of them. German soldiers. Not a patrol. Not a small group. An entire German infantry company. Roughly 150 soldiers dug into defensive positions directly ahead. Machine guns. Mortar teams. Riflemen hidden behind logs and dirt. Coolidge had walked straight into the center of a German position. And the Germans had already seen him. A moment of decision. For a split second everything stopped. Coolidge knew he had maybe 2 seconds to decide what to do. He could run. He could surrender. Or he could try something completely insane. Something no military manual had ever recommended. Coolidge stood up, raised his weapon, and shouted at the German soldiers. He demanded that they surrender to him. One American sergeant, standing in the open, facing more than 150 enemy soldiers. For a moment, The Germans simply stared. Then rifles lifted. Machine guns swung toward him. Coolidge fired first. His carbine cracked through the fog. 2 German soldiers fell. And then the forest exploded with gunfire. The run back to Hill 623. Bullets snapped past Coolidge as he turned and ran. Tree bark exploded around him. Branches shattered. German soldiers were shouting. They were already advancing. Coolidge and the American soldier sprinted back through the forest. They had seconds before the Germans reached the hill. When Coolidge burst back into the American position, he saw exactly what he feared. Some of the young replacements were frozen in place. Others looked ready to run. The sound of gunfire had shattered their nerves. They had never experienced combat before. They didn't know what to do. Coolidge did not shout. He did not panic. He started walking calmly along the line, pointing to positions, assigning fields of fire, checking the machine guns. His voice stayed steady, even as bullets started striking the trees around them, preparing for the attack. Coolidge knew the Germans were coming. He could hear them moving through the forest, branches breaking, voices shouting orders in German. Maybe 90 seconds until the assault. He placed riflemen beside each machine gun. Their job was to protect the gunners. If the Germans got too close, the rifles would stop them. Coolidge checked the Browning machine guns one more time. The belts of ammunition fed smoothly into the chambers. Everything was ready. Through the trees, gray uniforms appeared. The German assault had begun. The first attack. The German soldiers advanced quickly through the forest, moving from tree to tree, using the terrain for cover. Experienced infantry, men who had been fighting since the beginning of the war. They expected frightened American replacements. Easy targets. They walked into a wall of machine gun fire. Coolidge gave the command. The Browning machine guns roared. The forest erupted. German soldiers dropped instantly. Others dove behind trees. The attack collapsed before it reached the American line. For a few minutes, everything went quiet again. Then the Germans regrouped. And they attacked again. Cliffhanger end, Part 1. That first attack was only the beginning. Within the next few hours, the Germans would launch 4 separate assaults against Hill 623. Each one larger than the last. Each one deadlier. And Coolidge knew something terrifying. Even if they survived the first day, the Germans outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. Sooner or later, the ammunition would run out. Sooner or later, the hill would fall. Unless one exhausted sergeant could somehow keep 12 men fighting against an entire German company. And the worst part? This battle was only day 1. The German soldiers advanced quickly through the forest, moving from tree to tree, using the terrain for cover. Experienced infantry, men who had been fighting since the beginning of the war. They expected frightened American replacements. Easy targets. Instead, they walked into a storm of machine gun fire. Coolidge gave the command. Hold. Fire! The Browning machine guns roared to life. The sound tore through the forest like thunder. Long belts of ammunition fed through the receivers as the gunners pressed their triggers. The first wave of German soldiers dropped instantly. Others dove behind trees. Bullets smashed into trunks, spraying bark into the air. The forest that had been silent only seconds before was now alive with screaming metal. The first attack collapsed before it even reached the American foxholes. For a brief moment, the gunfire slowed. Smoke drifted between the trees. A few wounded German soldiers crawled for cover. Coolidge raised his hand. Cease fire. The machine guns stopped. Suddenly the forest became quiet again. Too quiet. Coolidge had seen this pattern before in Italy. The enemy would probe once, test the defense, measure the firepower. Then they would come again. Stronger. Smarter. And that is exactly what happened. The second attack came only 15 minutes later. This time the Germans spread out wider through the trees. Instead of charging directly at the machine guns, they tried to flank the American position. Rifle fire began snapping through the branches from multiple directions. One of the young American soldiers panicked and fired too early. Coolidge grabbed him by the shoulder. Wait for the command. The soldier's hands were shaking. He could barely hold his rifle steady. The Germans were getting closer. Closer than before. Coolidge waited until he could clearly see their helmets moving through the fog. Then he dropped his hand. Fire! Both Browning machine guns opened again. The heavy weapons cut through the forest with brutal efficiency. But this time the Germans didn't break as quickly. They kept pushing forward. One German squad managed to reach a fallen tree only 40 yards from the American line. From there they opened fire with rifles and a machine gun. Bullets began hitting the American foxholes. A young replacement soldier next to Coolidge cried out and fell backward. A round had ripped through his shoulder. Coolidge dragged him deeper into the trench. Stay down. Medic. There was no medic nearby. Everyone was already busy fighting. Coolidge grabbed a bandage from the soldier's pouch and wrapped the wound himself. Then he pushed the rifle back into the soldier's hands. You're still in this fight. The soldier nodded weakly and raised his weapon again. The firefight continued for nearly 20 minutes. Back and forth through the forest. Machine guns roaring. Rifles cracking. Bullets tearing through leaves and branches. Finally the Germans began pulling back. They dragged their wounded with them. The second attack had failed. But Coolidge knew something important. They weren't giving up. They were studying the defense. Learning the positions of the machine guns. And sooner or later, they would bring heavier weapons. Coolidge walked along the American line. Checking every foxhole. Checking ammunition. Checking the nerves of his men. Many of the replacements were pale. Some looked like they were about to collapse. It had been their first real battle. But they were still there. Still holding their rifles. Still defending the hill. Coolidge crouched next to one of the machine gun crews. How much ammo left? The gunner checked the belts. About 8 boxes, Sergeant. Coolidge did the math quickly in his head. Not nearly enough. If the Germans kept attacking at this pace, the ammunition would be gone by nightfall. And night fighting in a forest was even worse. He looked back toward the American rear lines. No reinforcements were coming. No supplies. They were completely alone. An hour passed. Then another. The rain continued falling steadily through the trees. Coolidge allowed the men to rotate positions. Some rested while others watched the forest. Nobody spoke much. They were all listening. Waiting. And eventually, they heard the Germans again. Branches snapping. Voices shouting in German. But this time there was a new sound mixed in. A metallic clanking. Heavy equipment being moved. Coolidge's stomach tightened. Mortars. The third attack began with explosions. German mortar shells crashed into the trees above the American position. Branches shattered. Wood fragments rained down like knives. One shell landed directly behind the machine gun nest. The blast threw 2 soldiers out of their foxhole. One of them didn't move again. The other crawled back to the position, ears ringing, face covered in mud. Coolidge grabbed him. Can you still fire? The soldier nodded. Then get back on that gun. More mortars exploded across the hill. The Germans were softening the defense before their next assault. And then the infantry came again. This time they were shouting. Charging directly through the fog. Rifles firing as they ran. The machine guns opened again. But the battlefield was chaos now. Explosions. Screaming men. Coolidge moved between the foxholes shouting orders. Keep firing. Short bursts. Watch the flanks. German soldiers reached within 30 yards of the line. Close enough that rifles became more important than machine guns. American soldiers fired as fast as they could reload. The forest echoed with the sound of battle. One German soldier rushed a foxhole with a grenade. Coolidge saw him. He raised his carbine and fired twice. The soldier dropped before he could throw it. The grenade rolled harmlessly into the mud. But the Germans kept coming. For a few terrifying minutes it looked like they might actually break through. Coolidge grabbed a rifle from a wounded soldier and joined the firing line himself. He shot one attacker. Then another. Then another. Finally, slowly, the German advance stopped. They began falling back again. The third assault had failed. But the cost was growing. 2 Americans were dead. 4 were wounded. The ammunition boxes were almost empty. Coolidge wiped rain and sweat from his face. This battle was only getting started. Late in the afternoon, the forest became quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. More dangerous. Coolidge sensed it immediately. The Germans had tried 3 infantry assaults. Now they would bring something stronger. He listened carefully. And after a few minutes, he heard it. A deep rumbling sound. Metal tracks grinding against rocks. His heart sank. Tanks. German armored vehicles slowly pushed through the forest toward Hill 623. Not large tanks, but armored assault guns. Low, powerful machines designed to smash infantry positions. The American soldiers stared in disbelief. Machine guns were useless against armor. Rifles were useless. Even grenades might not be enough. One of the replacements whispered the question everyone was thinking. "What do we do now, Sergeant?" Coolidge thought for a moment. Then he spoke calmly. "We stop them." The soldier looked confused. "With what?" Coolidge reached into his ammunition pouch and pulled out several grenades. "With these." The first German armored vehicle appeared between the trees. Its cannon swung slowly toward the American position. The machine guns opened fire anyway, not to damage it, but to keep the infantry behind it pinned down. The tank fired. The explosion shook the hill. Dirt and wood blasted into the air. Another shell followed. Coolidge grabbed 3 grenades and moved forward through the foxholes. Bullets were snapping around him. But he kept moving closer to the armored vehicle. 30 yards. 20 yards. 15 yards. The tank's machine gun began firing. Tracers cut through the trees. Coolidge ducked behind a fallen log. Pulled the pins from the grenades. Waited for the right moment. Then he stood and threw them. All 3 grenades landed directly under the front of the vehicle. The explosions rocked the tank. Smoke poured from its engine compartment. The vehicle stopped moving. Inside, the German crew bailed out. And ran. The American soldiers stared in shock. Coolidge walked back toward the line calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. But there were still more vehicles coming. And the sun was starting to disappear behind the trees. Night was coming. And the battle for Hill 623 was far from over. As darkness settled over the forest, Coolidge counted his remaining soldiers. 12 had started the day. Now only 8 were still able to fight. Ammunition was almost gone. Machine gun barrels were overheating. The wounded were lying silently in the trenches. Some whispering prayers. Others simply staring into the darkness. And somewhere out in that forest, more than 100 German soldiers were preparing for another attack. The longest night of the battle was about to begin. And none of the men on Hill 623 knew if they would live to see morning. And none of the men on Hill 623 knew if they would live to see morning. The rain continued to fall through the trees. Cold drops tapped slowly against helmets and rifles. The darkness of the Vosges forest grew thicker as night covered the battlefield. Somewhere out there, more than 100 German soldiers were regrouping. And Coolidge knew they would return. He moved quietly along the line of foxholes again. Only 8 soldiers were still able to fight. The others were wounded or dead. The machine guns were still in place, but ammunition was dangerously low. Coolidge crouched beside the gunner of the first Browning. "How much left?" The gunner lifted the lid of the ammo box. "Maybe 2 belts." "Sergeant." Coolidge nodded slowly. 2 belts would not last long if another full assault came. He moved to the second machine gun. "About the same here," the assistant gunner said. "That meant maybe 10 minutes of heavy fire. Maybe less." Coolidge looked out into the darkness between the trees. If the Germans attacked in large numbers again, the Americans would have to fight the rest of the battle with rifles and grenades. But retreat was impossible. Hill 623 had to hold. For almost 2 hours nothing happened. The forest stayed silent. Too silent. The soldiers tried to stay awake. Some leaned against the dirt walls of their foxholes. Others cleaned mud from their rifles. No one spoke much. The exhaustion of the day had begun to crush them. Coolidge felt it too. He had been fighting since early morning without rest. His uniform was soaked from rain and sweat. Mud covered his boots and gloves. But he refused to sit down. Leaders didn't rest when their men were still in danger. Instead, he kept walking slowly between the foxholes, checking each position, speaking quietly to each soldier. "You're doing good. Stay sharp. Just keep watching the trees." His calm voice helped more than he realized. The young replacements had stopped shaking. They trusted him now. If Sergeant Coolidge believed they could survive, maybe they actually could. Then suddenly, a flare shot into the sky. A bright white light exploded above the forest. The entire hill was illuminated. German voices shouted through the darkness. "Angriff!" Coolidge instantly understood what was happening. The Germans were launching a night assault, using flares to light the battlefield. Silhouettes began moving between the trees. Dozens of them. More than before. Coolidge raised his arm. "Hold fire, hold fire." The soldiers gripped their weapons tightly. The shapes kept coming closer. 30 yards. 20 yards. 15 yards. Coolidge dropped his arm. "Fire!" The last belts of machine gun ammunition ripped through the night. Muzzle flashes lit the foxholes like lightning. German soldiers fell as the bullets tore through their ranks. But this time the attackers did not stop. They kept advancing, stepping over their fallen comrades, firing rifles and submachine guns. Bullets began striking the American trenches. One machine gun suddenly went silent. The barrel had overheated and jammed. The gunner cursed and tried to clear it. But the Germans were already too close. "Rifles!" Coolidge shouted. The Americans switched to their personal weapons. The battle turned into a brutal close-range firefight. Rifles cracked rapidly. Grenades exploded among the trees. German soldiers tried to rush the foxholes. But every time they came too close, American rifle fire pushed them back. Coolidge fired his carbine again and again. Reload. Fire. Reload. Fire. A German soldier suddenly appeared only 10 yards away. Coolidge fired twice and dropped him instantly. Another soldier rushed forward with a grenade. Coolidge dove into the mud as the explosion shook the trench. The night battle had become chaos. The fight lasted nearly 40 minutes. Longer than any of the earlier attacks. The Germans were determined to take the hill. But the Americans refused to give it up. Finally, slowly, the attackers began pulling back into the darkness again. The flare light faded, and once again the forest became quiet. But this silence felt different. Heavier. More exhausted. Coolidge leaned against a tree for a moment. His arms were shaking slightly now. Not from fear. From fatigue. He looked down the line of foxholes. Only 6 soldiers were still able to fight. 2 more had been wounded during the night attack. But the hill was still theirs. Around midnight the rain finally stopped. A thin fog rolled through the forest. The temperature dropped quickly. Cold air filled the trenches. The wounded soldiers shivered quietly under their ponchos. Coolidge knew the men needed rest. But someone had to stay awake. He organized the remaining soldiers into short watch rotations. 2 men watching the forest at all times. The others resting for 20 minutes at a time. No one slept deeply. Every snapping branch made them jump. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like footsteps. Hours passed slowly. The longest night of their lives. Just before dawn, Coolidge heard a sound that made his stomach tighten again. Engines. Heavy engines. More armored vehicles were approaching through the forest. He moved to the edge of the hill and looked through the trees. Dark shapes were moving slowly toward them. Not 1 vehicle. Not 2. At least 4. Behind them marched dozens of German infantry. The enemy had decided to finish the battle with overwhelming force. Coolidge turned back to his men. They were exhausted, cold, low on ammunition. And now tanks were coming again. One of the soldiers asked quietly, "Sergeant, what if they break through this time?" Coolidge looked at him calmly. "They won't." The soldier asked another question. "What if they do?" Coolidge answered without hesitation. "Then we fight them right here." No one argued. They simply prepared their weapons again. The first armored vehicle rolled into view as the sun began to rise. Gray light filtered through the trees. German infantry followed behind the armor, using it as cover. The Americans opened fire with their rifles. But the tanks kept coming. Their cannons fired directly into the hill. Explosions ripped through the defensive line. One shell destroyed an entire foxhole. Dirt and smoke filled the air. Coolidge realized something immediately. They could not stop all 4 vehicles. But maybe they could scare them. He grabbed several grenades again and crawled forward through the mud. Bullets struck the ground around him. German soldiers were firing constantly now. But Coolidge kept moving closer to the lead vehicle. 20 yards. 15 yards. 10 yards. The tank's machine guns suddenly turned toward him. Coolidge rolled behind a fallen tree. He waited for the gun to pause between bursts. Then he stood up quickly, pulled the pin, and threw the grenade directly under the vehicle's track. The explosion echoed through the forest. The track snapped. The armored vehicle lurched sideways and stopped. Smoke began pouring from its engine. The German crew jumped out and ran. Seeing the lead vehicle disabled caused confusion among the others. The second vehicle stopped. The third reversed slightly. German infantry scattered for cover. Coolidge's soldiers seized the moment. They fired everything they had left. Rifles cracked rapidly. Grenades exploded among the trees. Within minutes the German attack collapsed again. For the 5th time, Hill 623 had survived. But the battle was not over. Not even close. Coolidge checked the remaining ammunition. Some soldiers had only 2 or 3 clips left. Grenades were nearly gone. And the Germans still outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. The exhausted soldiers looked at their sergeant, waiting for the next order. Coolidge looked out across the forest. Smoke drifted between the trees. German soldiers were regrouping again in the distance. He knew exactly what that meant. One final assault was coming. And this one would decide everything. Because if the Germans attacked again, there would be almost nothing left to stop them. Hill 623 would either hold or fall forever. And the next attack was already beginning to form in the trees. Coolidge could see them moving through the fog. Dark shapes between the tall trunks. German soldiers regrouping, preparing for one final push. The exhausted Americans on Hill 623 waited silently. No one spoke. No one complained. They simply held their rifles and stared into the forest. Because they all understood the truth now. This would be the last attack. If they stopped it, they might survive. If they failed, the Germans would overrun the hill. The morning light slowly grew stronger. Gray clouds hung low above the Vosges forest. Smoke drifted through the trees from the destroyed armored vehicle. German officers shouted orders somewhere in the distance. Then suddenly, a whistle blew. German infantry began moving forward again. Dozens of soldiers spread out through the trees. Some crouching, some running, others firing rifles as they advanced. Behind them, the remaining armored vehicles started moving again. Their engines growled as they climbed toward the hill. Coolidge raised his rifle. His voice was calm. Let them get closer. The American soldiers watched the enemy advance. 30 yards. 25. 20. Coolidge took a slow breath. Then he gave the order. Fire. The last American bullets exploded from the defensive line. Rifles cracked rapidly. Machine guns fired their final short bursts. German soldiers dropped across the forest floor. But the attackers kept coming. They were too many. The American ammunition was nearly gone. One by one the rifles began clicking empty. A soldier shouted, "I'm out." Another voice followed. "Me too." Within minutes the firing slowed dramatically. The Americans had almost nothing left. Coolidge looked around. Only a few clips remained. The Germans were now less than 20 yards away. If they reached the foxholes, the battle would turn into hand-to-hand combat. Coolidge made a decision instantly. He stood up inside the trench. "Fix bayonets." The metal blades snapped onto the ends of rifles. The soldiers looked at him. But ready. Coolidge climbed out of the foxhole and stood in the open. Bullets snapped past him. But he didn't move. He shouted toward the forest. "Come on." Then he began firing the last rounds from his rifle. The Americans joined him, standing up from the trenches, firing their final bullets. The sudden aggression shocked the German soldiers. They had expected exhausted defenders hiding in foxholes. Instead, they saw soldiers standing and fighting openly, refusing to retreat, refusing to surrender. For a moment, the German advance slowed. That moment was enough. Coolidge grabbed his last grenade, pulled the pin, and threw it toward the nearest group of attackers. The explosion echoed through the trees. Then something unexpected happened. The German soldiers began pulling back, slowly at first, then faster. Within minutes, the attackers were retreating again, dragging their wounded, disappearing into the forest. Hill 623 had held. For several long minutes, no one moved. The American soldiers stood there in disbelief. The forest was finally silent. No engines, no shouting, no gunfire, just the wind moving through the trees. One soldier looked at Coolidge. "Sergeant, did we win?" Coolidge looked out across the battlefield. German bodies were scattered among the trees. Destroyed equipment lay in the mud. Smoke rose slowly into the gray sky. Then he answered quietly, "Yes." Hours later, American reinforcements finally reached the hill. The new troops were shocked by what they saw. A tiny group of exhausted soldiers, surrounded by the evidence of a massive battle. German equipment everywhere, destroyed vehicles, and dozens of enemy casualties. The officer leading the reinforcements asked what had happened. One of the soldiers pointed toward Coolidge. Sergeant Coolidge held the hill. News of the battle spread quickly through the American army. A single squad had stopped repeated German attacks. They had faced infantry, mortars, armored vehicles, and overwhelming numbers. Yet they never abandoned their position. They never surrendered. And at the center of it all stood one calm, determined leader. Months later, that leader would receive one of the highest military honors in the world, the Medal of Honor. The award was given to Mitchell Page Coolidge for his extraordinary bravery during the fighting in the Battle of the Vosges Mountains. Against impossible odds, he refused to retreat. He refused to surrender. And because of that courage, Hill 623 never fell.